Inside the silent, dimly lit halls of the British Museum, there are artifacts that the Chinese state calls scars. Every time a delegation from Beijing walks past these stolen treasures, they aren't just looking at jade or porcelain. They are looking at the physical evidence of why the West can never and will never be trusted again. For most of the world, the rise of China is a modern economic miracle, a story of factories, high-speed rails, and microchips. But for the leadership in Zhongnanhai, this is not a beginning. It is a long-delayed homecoming. It is the closing of a bloody circle that began 2 centuries ago with opium and ironclad warships. Today, we are witnessing a tectonic shift. The era of engagement is dead. The illusion that trade would turn China into a Western-style democracy has shattered into a million pieces of broken glass. Why does China look at every olive branch from Washington as a hidden dagger? Why does Beijing believe that the West is a declining predator, desperate to kill the rising challenger before its own light fades? To understand the cold, calculated defiance of modern China, we must peel back the layers of a collective national trauma. We must travel back to a time when the Middle Kingdom was bled dry by those who claimed to be civilizing it. This is the story of the dragon's journey from a broken victim to a global challenger. This is why the trust is gone and why it might never return. You are watching Audio Point, and today we decode the deep-seated psychology of an empire that remembers everything. In the mid-19th century, the world's largest economy was not a Western power. It was the Qing dynasty. China was a self-sufficient giant, a civilization that looked down upon the rest of the world as barbarians. They didn't need the West's trinkets, but the West desperately needed China's tea, silk, and porcelain. The trade imbalance was a hemorrhaging wound for the British Empire. They were paying for luxury with silver, and the silver was running out. So, the British did something that would forever define the Western character in the Chinese psyche. They became the world's largest drug cartel. They flooded China with opium, grown in the fields of India. It wasn't just a business, it was a weapon of mass destruction. Millions of Chinese lives were wrecked. The social fabric of the empire began to fray. When the emperor finally struck back, seizing and destroying the poison, the British didn't apologize. They sent the Royal Navy. This was the birth of gunboat diplomacy. The Chinese, with their wooden junks and ancient cannons, were slaughtered by the industrial might of the HMS Nemesis. The resulting Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 was the first of what China calls the unequal treaties. It wasn't just about trade, it was about humiliation. Hong Kong was sliced away. Massive indemnities were demanded. Extraterritoriality meant that Westerners could commit crimes on Chinese soil and be immune to Chinese law. To the Chinese mind, the West's rules-based order was born from the barrel of a gun and the smoke of an opium pipe. This was the start of the century of humiliation, a 100-year period where China was carved up like a ripe melon by the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, and eventually the Japanese. The psychological impact of this era cannot be overstated. It is the foundational myth of the modern Chinese state. In Western history books, the Opium Wars are a footnote. In Chinese textbooks, they are the primary lesson. The lesson is simple. If you are weak, you will be bullied. If you trust the barbarian, you will be betrayed. This isn't just history to them, it is a warning. Every time a U.S. Secretary of State talks about human rights or international law, the Chinese leadership hears the echoes of the British missionaries who preached the gospel while their brothers sold opium on the docks. They see the hypocrisy as a permanent feature of the Western DNA. The betrayal reached its peak in 1919 at the Palace of Versailles. China had joined World War I on the side of the Allies, sending 140,000 laborers to the trenches of France, hoping that a victory would mean the return of their territories seized by Germany. Instead, the Western powers sat in a gilded room and handed those territories to Japan. The Wilsonian idealism of self-determination was a lie meant only for Europeans. This was the spark that ignited the May 4th movement, the true birth of modern Chinese nationalism. It was the moment China realized that even when you sit at the table of the victors, the West will treat you as a menu item, not a guest. When the bells of the Forbidden City rang in 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop Tiananmen Gate and declared, "The Chinese people have stood up." It wasn't just a political victory for communism, it was a psychological divorce from the West. For decades, China shuttered its windows. It endured the chaos of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. But beneath the surface of the poverty, a steel-hardened resolve was forming. The dragon realized that ideology was secondary to sovereignty. To never be bullied again, China needed more than just a red flag. It needed the ultimate insurance policy. When China tested its first nuclear weapon in 1964, the West was horrified. But for Beijing, it was the first night they slept without the fear of a Western blockade. This was the era of self-reliance. However, by the late 1970s, a new architect emerged. Deng Xiaoping looked at the world and saw a different path. He saw that the Soviet Union was crumbling under the weight of its own isolation. He realized that to defeat the West, China first had to learn from the West. This began the era of hide your strength, bide your time, Dao Guangyang Hui. It was a masterclass in strategic patience. Deng invited Western capital, Western technology, and Western management. He opened the special economic zones like Shenzhen, turning them into the world's sweatshop. The West looked at this and smiled. They thought they were winning. From Washington to London, the consensus was arrogant. As China gets richer, they will become more like us. They will want Starbucks, they will want Hollywood, and eventually, they will want democracy. This was the Great Western Delusion. The West viewed trade as a tool of transformation. China viewed trade as a tool of restoration. While American corporations were moving their factories to the Pearl River Delta to save on labor costs, the Chinese Communist Party was conducting the largest transfer of wealth and technology in human history. Every joint venture was a classroom. Every outsourced blueprint was a lesson in reverse engineering. Beijing wasn't joining the global system to be a junior partner. They were studying the system to eventually replace it. The year 2001 was the turning point. When China entered the World Trade Organization, WTO, the floodgates opened. The American middle class began to hollow out as millions of manufacturing jobs migrated east. In exchange, the West got cheap iPhones and plastic toys. But China got something far more valuable: foreign exchange reserves. They began buying up American debt, effectively becoming the banker to their own rival. They watched as the United States spent trillions of dollars and thousands of lives in the sands of Iraq and Afghanistan. To the strategists in Beijing, the 2008 financial crisis was the aha moment. As Wall Street collapsed and Western banks begged for bailouts, the myth of Western institutional superiority died. China didn't just survive the crisis, they grew through it. The internal narrative shifted from learning from the West to surpassing the West. The Beijing Consensus was born. It proved that you could have high-speed growth, high-tech surveillance, and a massive middle class without a single Western-style election. When Xi Jinping took power in 2012, the hide and bide era was officially over. The dragon was no longer hiding. She introduced the Chinese dream, a vision of national rejuvenation that explicitly required the ending of Western hegemony in Asia. For the first time since the Opium Wars, China was no longer reacting to Western moves. They were making the moves, from the artificial islands in the South China Sea to the high-tech corridors of Huawei. China began to build a world where the West's permission was no longer required. The West reacted with shock. They called it cheating. They called it intellectual property theft. But in the tea rooms of Beijing, they simply called it catching up. To them, the West's rules were never meant to be fair. They were meant to keep the hierarchy intact. Why should China respect a patent system designed by the people who burnt down the Summer Palace? Why should they respect a maritime law written by the empires that blockaded their ports? The trust didn't just evaporate. It was never really there. It was a tactical truce, a marriage of convenience that was always destined for a messy divorce. And as the 2020s dawned, the world realized that the divorce would not be peaceful. It would be a battle for the very soul of the 21st century. In the high-tech cleanrooms of Taiwan and the silicon corridors of Santa Clara, a new kind of war is being fought. It is a war without bullets, but its casualties will be the world's most powerful economies. This is the chip war, and for Beijing, it is the ultimate proof of Western betrayal. For decades, the global supply chain was built on the promise of comparative advantage. The West would design the brains, and China would build the bodies. But as China began to design its own brain's artificial intelligence, 5G, and quantum computing, the West slammed the door shut. The 2022 to 2024 export controls on advanced semiconductors were, in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party, a declaration of economic war. It wasn't about national security, it was about national strangulation. Beijing watched as Washington pressured the Netherlands, Japan, and South Korea to cut off the supply of the lithography machines required to make the world's fastest chips. To China, this was a 21st century version of the 19th century naval blockades. The message was clear: you are allowed to be our factory, but you are not allowed to be our peer. This shattered the last remnants of the globalist dream in Beijing. If the West could weaponize the very foundations of the digital economy at the push of a button, then no Chinese company was safe. The response was a massive state-led all-of-nation effort to achieve silicon sovereignty. Billions of dollars were poured into SMIC and Huawei. Every engineer was told, your keyboard is a bayonet. This wasn't just industrial policy, it was a survival strategy. By 2025 and moving into 2026, the world has split into two distinct technological ecosystems, one led by the US and one led by China. This is the digital Iron Curtain. In the global south, from Southeast Asia to Africa and South America, countries are being forced to choose: do you build your future on Western code, which comes with lectures on human rights and the risk of being unplugged by Washington? Or do you build it on Chinese hardware, which comes with no questions asked and a direct line to Beijing? For China, the rules-based international order is now viewed as nothing more than a Western country club where the rules are changed whenever a non-Western member starts winning the game. They saw the seizure of Russian central bank reserves in 2022. They saw the weaponization of the SWIFT payment system. They didn't see these as punishments for a war in Ukraine. They saw them as a rehearsal for what the West would do to China if Beijing ever moved on Taiwan. The psychological shift is now complete. Beijing has stopped trying to fix the relationship with the West. Instead, they are building a West-proof economy. This is the logic behind the dual circulation strategy. Internal circulation means making the Chinese domestic market so strong and self-sufficient that no external blockade can starve the people. External circulation means making the rest of the world so dependent on Chinese green tech batteries and pharmaceuticals that the West cannot afford to sanction them. Look at the electric vehicle EV revolution. While the West was debating climate policy, China was cornering the market on lithium processing and battery manufacturing. Today, the world cannot go green without going through China. This is the inverted blockade. Beijing is no longer the victim of the supply chain. They are the gatekeepers of the future. Every time Europe or America threatens tariffs on Chinese EVs, Beijing reminds them of their dependence on Chinese graphite and rare earth minerals. It is a cold, hard stalemate built on mutual distrust. In 2026, the rhetoric coming out of the Great Hall of the People is no longer about win-win cooperation. The leadership has accepted that the West will never truly accept a powerful, sovereign, and non-Western China. They believe the West is in a state of terminal decline, distracted by internal culture wars, crippled by debt, and losing its grip on the global South. For China, the lack of trust is not a tragedy. It is a clarity. It is the clarity of knowing that you are on your own, and that for the first time in 200 years, you have the power to say no. Beijing's lack of trust in the West has birthed a new reality. If you cannot join the club, you build a bigger one. This is the logic of the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and the rapid expansion of BRICS plus 4 decades. The World Bank and the IMF were the only games in town. They offered loans, but they came with conditionalities, demands for privatization, austerity, and political reform. To the global South, this felt like neocolonialism. To China, it was an opportunity. China began building bridges, ports, and power plants from Pakistan to Peru. They didn't ask about human rights records or election transparency. They asked for resources and strategic alignment. By 2026, BRI has evolved from a simple infrastructure project into a comprehensive alternative to the Western financial system. It is now a digital Silk Road, a green Silk Road, and most importantly, a space Silk Road, utilizing the Beidou satellite system to bypass GPS. The expansion of Brics in 2024, bringing in powerhouses like Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, Ethiopia, and Egypt was the final nail in the coffin of the unipolar moment. This is the majority world standing up. When China looks at this group, they don't see a perfect alliance. They see a cordon sanitaire against Western sanctions. If the US dollar is the exorbitant privilege of Washington, then the petro-yuan and local currency settlements are the escape hatches for everyone else. The strategy is de-risking from the West, while making the West dependent on China impossible. In the meeting rooms of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, the conversation is no longer about how to please the G7. It is about how to ignore them. For Beijing, the West's moral authority died in the ruins of Gaza, and the hypocrisy of international law applied only to enemies. They see a West that is loud on values, but quiet on development. China's pitch to the world is simple. We give you 5G and high-speed rail. They give you lectures and sanctions. As we stand in 2026, the golden era of globalization is a ghost. We have entered a period of armed peace, where the absence of trust is the only constant. China's refusal to trust the West is not a temporary policy of the Xi Jinping administration. It is a structural reality of a civilization that has reclaimed its place at the center of the world. They believe that for the West to win, China must stay down. And since China refuses to stay down, conflict, whether economic, technological, or eventually kinetic, is viewed as inevitable. The West calls this a threat to the liberal order. China calls it the Great Rejuvenation. The tragedy of this lack of trust is the paralysis of global solutions. On climate change, on pandemic prevention, on the regulation of artificial intelligence, the two suns in our sky cannot agree on the time of day. Every Chinese green tech breakthrough is labeled a security threat in Washington. Every Western privacy law is labeled protectionism in Beijing. We are living in a fractured world where the truth depends on which side of the digital Iron Curtain you stand on. For the audience of macro history, the lesson is clear. History is not a straight line. Toward Western-style progress, it is a cycle of empires. China is not a new power. It is the world's oldest continuous civilization returning to its default setting. Their memory is long, their patience is infinite, and their distrust is earned. The dragon has survived the Opium Wars, the collapse of the Qing, the brutality of the World Wars, and the isolation of the Cold War. It has learned that in the arena of great power politics, there are no friends-only interests and leverage. As the West looks at the rising shadow of the East, it must realize that the China it faces today is a mirror of its own past actions. Will there ever be trust again? Perhaps not in our lifetime. Because for China to trust the West would have to accept being an equal, not a master. And for the West to trust China, China would have to stop being China. Neither seems likely. We are moving into a century where the only thing we can trust is the certainty of confrontation.